Risk management. In this course, we have tried not to orientate towards any particular style of project management, and instead focus on the fundamentals. It is necessary to follow this path with the study of risk in the project context too. Risk management plays an interesting role in project management. Managing risk is chiefly about identifying risks, understanding the effect they might have on the organization and its industry, and attempting to ensure that there's a sound response in place to allow for the organization's survival and growth, if at all possible. There is always a trade-off between opportunity and risk. Trade-off decisions lie at the heart of strategy and risk decision-making. An organization should not only be well versed in the organization's risk exposure, but should also have set up a basic background project risk management alarm system, or at least incorporated risk management concerns into the environmental scanning alarms. This system can be as broad or as narrow as the designer desires. Risks that the organization and/or project is exposed to can be extensive and might include fundamental external environmental risks, internal organizational risks, broad operational risks, and outliers such as fraud and other unscrupulous behavior. Risk management is a subject in itself. For our purposes, we need a straightforward base that will allow us to build a rudimentary risk management system. In time, the system can grow, evolve, and become more sophisticated. First, let's consider some of the generic terms that we use to categorize risk. Generic risk categories. In order to conceptually segment risk within an organization, we divide the different risks into categories. Strategic risk, operational risk, project, /change risk, unforeseen risk. Strategic risk. Ultimately, the organization will have a basic risk attitude. This attitude will spill over to many aspects of the organization. This attitude will have an influence and is something that we should be aware of. This risk attitude might be influenced by circumstances, historic experiences, or leadership, and can range from risk-seeking to risk-neutral to risk-adverse. This will result in a prevailing attitude towards risk and reward. For example, an organization that believes it owes its success to seizing the moment will generally have a higher tolerance for risk than an organization that believes its success is thanks to careful and prudent decision-making. This goes further. If we can use some gambling terms, some will try and win the whole pot. Some will play cautiously, some will be happy making small wins, and some will measure their performance on how much they lost as opposed to how much they won. We are moving a little too far into the risk paradigm. However, one can see how complex the concept of risk and winning is. Strategic risk is long-term in nature, concerns the strategic direction of the organization, and is associated with linking and measuring the risk aspect with a particular strategic choice. Strategic risk concerns both internal and external environmental factors. Generally, the responsibility for this type of risk lies with the most senior managers, but the devil is in the detail. Strategic risk relates to projects too. Operational risk. Operational risk relates to the day-to-day operations of the organization and the risks associated with these operations. Because of this, it is very relevant to project management. Mitigating these static and speculative risks can sometimes be built into procedure, and is sometimes required by law. Mitigation is sometimes primarily based on the fear of being sued. Change risk. This type of risk is associated with projects. It's often associated with any operation that is not considered part of the day-to-day business as usual. It is sometimes even called change/project risk. Some might be confused here. Don't be concerned. These are titles meant to categorize complex risk behaviors. Later, we'll be identifying specific risks. As long as you and the viewers of your data understand the categories that you have chosen for your analysis, you will succeed in delivering a sound analysis. Back to change risk. It is generally short-term in nature. While the risk should be contained within the project, risk interdependency should not be underestimated. Risk interdependency in the connections between different risks. This can lead to risk magnification. Change risks are often unique and sometimes are only associated with the specific project. It's worth considering that in a change management program, the project risk will be very closely associated with strategic risk. Thus, the interdependency will be acute. As with project, time, cost, and quality are the measurements for change risk. This is interesting and convenient because it highlights how intertwined risk is with the entire project management paradigm. Unforeseen risks. These are risks that are extremely difficult to predict. While they are possible, they are considered unlikely. When these risks occur, it is usually the result of interconnections with other risks. Consider the financial market collapse in 2008 due to, amongst other interconnected factors, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the subprime housing bubble. Quite often these risks are not monitored due to a failure to identify, assess, monitor, or control the risks and their associated interdependencies. Another example could be the COVID-19 pandemic. We have known for some time that there was an imminent threat of a pandemic that could have a disastrous effect on our way of life. But when these risks occur, they still seem to have come out of the blue. The failure to predict the ramification of these risks could really be the result of a haze of risk interdependency complexity. These types of risks can therefore be reasonably foreseen, but are not or have not been. There is no doubt the high cost of mitigating for all types of risk plays a role in the lack of preparedness that we seem to see so often. There is also the role of wishful thinking. Unforeseeable risk. Unforeseeable risks cannot be reasonably foreseen in our universe. These are risks that are entirely unexpected, such as the continent of America sinking into the ocean. An extreme example, I know, but there is a line, and the line between the unforeseeable and the unforeseen is sometimes difficult to see. We can attempt to prepare for them by designing disaster recovery plans, and contingency planning will also provide some solutions to their occurrence. A significant fear for all risk managers, a failure in their duty to identify risks that could not be considered either unforeseen or unforeseeable. Cascade/interdependency risk. Risks unfortunately have a habit of affecting other risks. This knock-on effect is called cascade risk and can either be foreseen or unforeseen. Risk magnification due to the multiplier effect will also take place in a cascade situation. So where do we start? First, we conduct an environmental scanning process, relating, of course, to identifying types of risk. We then categorize these risks using a risk map. Then we attempt to consider interrelationships with other risk. We call these risk interdependencies. Then we place a value on each risk. Frequently, a figure from 1 to 5 is used. And finally, we prepare for dealing with these risks, should they come to fruition. We call this risk mitigation. Monitoring and controlling risk falls into this area and is ultimately part of a risk management system. Let's start. Identify risk. The scanning process. This is normally done via the Nominal or Group Technique, the Delphi Technique, or Informal Brainstorming. These are all incredibly powerful techniques that can be used in many applications, and conducting these efforts with associates can have extremely positive effects relating to esprit de corps. Let's briefly go over these techniques. The Nominal Group Technique. A multidisciplinary panel of experts is assembled. A brainstorming facilitator usually starts by utilizing lists, normally on a flip chart or whiteboard. A process of discussion takes place, and the choices are ranked. Gradually, the rankings are agreed upon. The idea revolves around a process of distillation, from thesis, the idea, to antithesis, the argument against the idea, to the goal, which is the synthesis. The process is repeated again and again, the distillation process, until a level of satisfaction is achieved. The Delphi Technique. In this approach, the idea is to try and secure the contribution of people who are experts in the area under consideration. The process starts with a group of experts who are unaware of each other. They are posed a question. They consider this and compile an answer. This can be done by email, letter, or in person. The facilitator compares and compiles a summary of the experts' opinions. This is communicated back to the experts, inviting them to resubmit an answer in light of the new and additional information that they have been provided. After a few rounds of this process, a consensus should gradually form, and the proposal would be formulated. This can be submitted to the experts for a final opinion. This is a powerful technique, especially when email is the only reasonable conduit for information transfer. Informal brainstorming. When informal brainstorming, a coordinator or facilitator is generally appointed. There are generally two phases, the creative phase and then the evaluation phase. The facilitator will inform the individuals that nothing is out of bounds, all suggestions are welcome, and that everyone should aim to be open with their thoughts. She could then start by making a quite outrageous but appropriate suggestion to kick off the process. Ideas need to be recorded. Consensus can be built by debate. Next, we'll cover categorizing the risk using a basic risk matrix. Some like to compartmentalize risk into categories based on animals. For example, lions, sharks, rabbits, and mice. Sharks can be dangerous, and this is exasperated due to their maneuverability in water. Lions are powerful, and if they strike, which is highly likely if in their proximity, then the consequences will be serious. Rabbits dig holes, thus cause damage to gardens and even the foundations of your building or house. And mice can cause a lot of trouble in your home, despite the fact that they are small and look quite harmless. Although you might encounter this type of model, we will leave it and instead stick with words. They are clearer. It is, however, interesting to conceptualize risk in this manner, if only for a moment. This is a risk map. Consider whether the information required for the risk map comes from leading or lagging indicators. This risk map is dynamic, so needs to be reassessed regularly. When the risk is identified, a value needs to be assigned to it. This value is subject to change. So we have identified the risks. We have assigned values to each risk. We must now consider interconnectivity between different risks. And because of this, we need to understand risk networking. A risk network consists of nodes. Each node represents a certain risk. This risk could be identified as, for example, electric pump 1. And the value that is placed on this risk will have been established using practices that we have discussed and practices that we will discuss. Establishing risk values is incredibly difficult, and they will most likely only be reasonable estimates. These values are important, as is any input into a model. So it's wise to include this aspect in the group brainstorming techniques that we have used for the risk identification process. As we move along the risk network, we will see nodes expanding or contracting in size depending on their preceding risk inputs. Therefore, risk nodes expand and contract due to the nodes that they are connected to. Should the electric pump that was mentioned previously fail, then the other electric pumps will take more load. And this might in turn lead to a catastrophic failure if no backup solution has been established. Thus, the backup solution would provide mitigation and reduce the size of the node. This is complicated to model, which is why dynamic algorithms are often utilized. Sometimes it's possible to assign values that can be simply worked out. So say, for example, if there are 5 printers in your operation and one breaks down, then the organization's printer output capability is reduced. This slide illustrates some of the conceptual basics regarding mapping risk from the point of view of magnification through a conceptual risk network. It also touches on how values could be added to a risk model. The implicit effect of cascade risk can also be imagined. Formula. There are many methods by which risk can be calculated. This is the formula we will be considering. Magnitude equals probability times impact. And the user could consider using a scale for risk magnitude of 1 to 5. By introducing values to our model, it helps us sort and quantify risk to some degree. It also highlights a problem with risk management. All this data is based on the perceptions of the designer and the individuals in the brainstorming groups. Granted, there is some sound evidence-based data that is included in these assessments. However, there is still a significant amount of perception-based data. We can attempt to provide reasonably accurate figures. However, they will still be largely based on perceptions. And when this is coupled with the multiplier effect of cascade risk, the instability of the whole model will increase exponentially. This can create large, untrustworthy risk models that fail catastrophically. Perhaps this is why risk is so fascinating. It also should serve as a warning. Keep things simple. Understand the system's weaknesses and be part of the dynamic risk monitoring process. Mitigating risk. There will always be a level of residual risk that is impossible to mitigate for. Often this is far larger than you would reasonably expect. Consider, for example, the risk that an individual has to take on if they choose to start a business. Some risks can be insured against, and some can't. There are various names that are used to categorize different types of risk. Frequently, these names are industry-specific and even paradigm-specific. For example, are we considering risk terminology in a military setting, a business setting, an insurance setting, or a judicial setting? Dynamic risk has a different meaning when associated with repeat offenders in the judicial system than it does when associated with the outbound logistics arm of a large warehouse in a business setting. Risk is its own paradigm, so we need to be careful. Industries straddle many spheres of influence. Other risks have to be accepted. These risks can be mitigated for by essentially having backup solutions. Transferring the risk to someone else, via outsourcing for example, or improving, changing, or eliminating systems. One could reduce the risk of devastating fire damage by purchasing an advanced firefighting system. Mitigating risk often requires imagination. Risk comes from internal factors and external factors. Some risk is so unforeseen that it is simply not financially viable to purchase solutions. However, this does not mean mitigation is not possible. I mentioned electric pumps earlier on in this film. In order to allow this learning to set, so to speak, I suggest you look into the Fukushima nuclear disaster that occurred in 2011. One of the significant causes of this disaster, and a contributor to the Cascade effect, was the positioning of the electric pumps. The cost of having these pumps situated in a more suitable position would have been small when considered against the costs of leaving them where they were left. Other avenues of research you could look into would be the Grenfell Tower fire tragedy of 2017, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 1986, and the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe of 2010. The information pertaining the risk failings in these examples are freely available. You will notice that many of these disasters could have been prevented. The benefit of hindsight allows us to say this with ease. However, this is a fact. Lessons can always be learned. The learning organization attempts to avoid falling into the trap of allowing risks to evolve and cascade so as to develop into situations such as these. A risk management system should be embraced as an invaluable part of the project management subsystem and the larger organizational system.